December 20th, 1944. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. Snow falls heavy on the battered pines, the bitter cold cutting through threadbare uniforms. In a makeshift trench carved into frozen earth, a group of German infantrymen huddle together, shivering. They are exhausted, gaunt, and hungry. For days, their meals have been little more than thin slices of dark bread and a watery soup made from turnips. But this morning, something remarkable happens. One soldier tears open a small green tin, pried from the pack of a captured American GI. Inside, gleaming in the dim light, are things almost unimaginable. Chocolate bars wrapped in silver foil, neatly packed cigarettes, a small can of beef stew, powdered milk, and, most unbelievable of all, a sachet of real coffee. A stunned murmur spreads among the men. They whisper as though they've uncovered treasure. The Amerikaner leben wie Könige, one mutters under his breath. The Americans live like kings. Another turns the chocolate bar over in his hand, half in disbelief, half in awe. A diary entry from a German soldier later recorded, "We had nothing, and yet the Americans were fed as though they were on holiday. Their coffee, their chocolate, it was like luxury from another world." For these wary soldiers of Hitler's Wehrmacht, the discovery is both a revelation and a humiliation. They had been told the Americans were weak, soft, unprepared for war. Yet here they sit in the frozen forest, discovering that even the average American private is better fed than most German officers. The contrast is stark, and the realization is cutting. Food, the most basic of needs, has become a weapon of war. The German army entered World War II with the Eiserne Portion, the so-called iron ration. It was a simple, austere kit: a slice of hard bread, a can of preserved meat, and a packet of ersatz coffee or tea. The idea was not comfort, but survival. Soldiers were told to keep their iron ration untouched unless ordered otherwise. Day-to-day meals came from field kitchens, known as Gulaschkanonen, literally goulash cannons, which ladled out steaming potatoes, stews thick with cabbage, and black rye bread. In the early years of victory, when Germany plundered the food stores of conquered lands, Wehrmacht soldiers ate relatively well. A German infantryman might receive up to 3,900 calories per day in 1939, nearly equal to his American counterpart. But as the war dragged on, the situation deteriorated. By 1941, the Eastern Front was swallowing men and resources in staggering numbers. German food supply lines stretched thin across Russia's vast steppes. Allied bombing campaigns began hammering German agriculture and transport. Ersatz became the norm: artificial coffee brewed from roasted barley, margarine instead of butter, bread stretched with sawdust fillers, soups thickened with turnips. By late 1944, many German soldiers were receiving fewer than 2,000 calories a day, barely half of what they needed to fight in freezing conditions. Diaries record constant hunger. "We think always of bread," wrote one soldier, "bread and fat, for we have none." Across the Atlantic, the American approach to rations was entirely different. The U.S. Army, guided by nutritionists and backed by vast industrial capacity, treated food as a critical part of morale and efficiency. By 1942, standardized systems of rations were developed: the C ration, the K ration, the 10-in-1 pack for squads, and the legendary D ration bar engineered by Hershey. These were not luxuries, but carefully designed science. A single K ration provided around 2,800 calories per day, neatly packed in 3 small boxes: breakfast, dinner, supper. Inside were biscuits, canned meat, sugar, chewing gum, powdered drinks, and most importantly, chocolate and coffee.
The Americans took their coffee so seriously that instant Nescafe became a standard issue, packed in small envelopes to be mixed with hot water and a helmet or canteen cup. The GI's lifeline, one officer called it. Chocolate, meanwhile, was more than candy. It was morale in solid form. By 1944, Hershey's was producing over 24 million bars per week for the military. Some were bitter, high-calorie D bars meant as emergency food. Others were sweet treats distributed as comfort. The contrast could not have been more stark. An American private trudging through mud in Normandy could still expect cigarettes, hot coffee, and chocolate in his ration tin. A German private, at the same time, often relied on looted potatoes or half-rotten vegetables from nearby fields. Statistically, the difference was clear. U.S. daily ration, approximately 4,000 calories. German daily ration by late 1944, approximately 1,500 to 2,000 calories, often lower on the front. American supplies shipped to Europe in 1944, 17 million tons. German supplies dwindling under Allied blockade and bombing. For the Wehrmacht, food shortages eroded morale just as surely as ammunition shortages weakened defense. For the Americans, abundant rations became part of the soldier's identity. As one GI remembered, "We always had cigarettes, we always had coffee." The Germans couldn't believe it. By the time the Ardennes offensive was launched, this imbalance had become a psychological weapon as much as a logistical one. To German soldiers, American rations looked like luxury. To American soldiers, they were simply the taste of home, carried into war.
By 1943, as the war's momentum shifted against the Axis, the imbalance in supply chains was becoming undeniable. The German High Command had long believed that American troops so far from home could never sustain themselves in prolonged campaigns. In theory, the Atlantic Ocean was a natural blockade. In practice, American industry and logistics shattered this assumption. Nowhere was this more evident than in food. The United States not only fed its own troops overseas, but also supplied its allies under Lend-Lease. Ships carried canned meat to Britain, powdered milk to the Soviet Union, and wheat to starving populations across Europe. The American soldier became a symbol of plenty in a world of scarcity. Historian Stephen Ambrose noted, "The German soldier could not fathom the abundance of the American ration. Where he carried bread and lard, the GI carried meat, sugar, chocolate, and coffee." This abundance wasn't accidental. It was carefully engineered. In 1944, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had perfected the art of feeding millions. A network of depots, bakeries, canneries, and packaging plants churned out standardized rations in unimaginable numbers. Each GI's kit was not only a meal, but a portable morale booster. Chocolate for quick energy, gum and cigarettes for stress, powdered drinks to lift spirits. Even small details carried psychological weight. American rations often included matches, toilet paper, and salt tablets, luxuries that made the life of a GI feel human in the midst of war. Meanwhile, German troops grew increasingly reliant on capturing enemy supplies. During the Italian campaign, Wehrmacht diaries recorded entire units rejoicing when they seized American ration crates. Soldiers marveled at the contents, describing the chocolate as worth more than gold and the coffee as unimaginable luxury. One officer reportedly scolded his men for gorging on captured Hershey bars, warning, "You are fighting for the Führer, not for chocolate." Yet, the very fact such warnings were needed revealed the power of these rations. The symbolic turning point came in the summer of 1944, after the Normandy landings. The Allies had established a supply system of breathtaking efficiency, the Red Ball Express. Thousands of trucks thundered across newly liberated France, carrying everything from ammunition to food. The German expectation that Allied armies would slow down for lack of supplies collapsed. Instead, American divisions advanced faster than predicted, fueled by steady rations and coffee brewed on the move. A German general captured later confessed, "We thought the Americans would break under the weight of their own supply needs. Instead, their supply lines were their greatest weapon." By late 1944, German soldiers faced a humiliating reality. Their enemy was not only better armed, but better fed. The humble chocolate bar and the steaming cup of coffee became emblems of American strength. For men raised on Nazi propaganda about the supposed decadence of democracy, the shock was profound. The Americans were not weak. If anything, their comforts made them stronger. The turning point had come.
The war was no longer simply about tactics on the battlefield. It was about logistics, calories, and the ability to keep men fighting day after day. And in this arena, the United States was unbeatable.
December 16th, 1944. Adolf Hitler launched his last great gamble in the West, Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes Offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was audacious: smash through the thinly held American lines, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies. Success, Hitler believed, would force the Western Allies to negotiate, freeing Germany to turn fully against the Soviets. But from the very beginning, the offensive revealed not only the courage of the German soldier, but the fragility of his stomach. German divisions entered the Ardennes hungry, undersupplied, and heavily dependent on capturing Allied stores. Many of their supply convoys lacked fuel. Some units carried only 2 or 3 days' worth of food. Commanders told their men to seize American depots as they advanced. One German officer briefed his troops bluntly: "Your supplies are the enemy's supplies. Take them or you will go hungry." In contrast, American GIs were cold, weary, and often surprised by the ferocity of the attack, but they were not starving. Even in the chaos of retreat and counterattack, quartermaster trucks rumbled forward, bringing sea rations, cigarettes, and coffee. In foxholes and dugouts, soldiers brewed Nescafe in helmets, heated over small fires, a thin lifeline of warmth against the brutal winter. As one GI recalled, it was the coffee that kept us sane. You'd hear shells, but you'd smell coffee too.
The contrast was so sharp that it became a running theme in captured diaries. A German paratrooper wrote on December 19th, "We found American rations in a village house: meat, chocolate, biscuits, even cigarettes. It is paradise compared to our lot." Another wrote bitterly, "We march on empty stomachs, and yet the Americans eat like lords." For the Germans, capturing American food became nearly as important as capturing ground. Many attacks slowed as men ransacked ration depots. The 2nd Panzer Division paused for hours when it overran a U.S. supply dump near Bastogne, as starving soldiers stuffed themselves on canned meat and candy. For a short moment, the battlefield became less about Hitler's grand strategy and more about survival. Meanwhile, American defenders at Bastogne, surrounded and cut off, endured on their own supply caches. Cold sea rations, D-bars, and scalding black coffee sustained the 101st Airborne as they held out against overwhelming odds. When German envoys demanded their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McCulloch's one-word reply, "Nuts," carried a double edge. On the surface, it was defiance, but it also symbolized confidence that the Americans could hold out, sustained by their own supplies until relief arrived.
The outcome of the battle underscored the reality. Though initially stunned, the Americans recovered, regrouped, and counterattacked. The Germans had overextended, and their gamble relied on speed and captured resources. But American logistics did not collapse. Trucks kept running, supply dumps were re-established, and fresh rations reached the front. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. They had gained ground, but lost men, tanks, and time they could never replace. Historians often describe the Ardennes as a test of American grit and German desperation, but in the foxholes, the difference was felt in something as small as a chocolate bar. One U.S. veteran later remarked, "We didn't think of it then, but when you had coffee in your belly and the enemy didn't, you already had an edge." For German soldiers, the discovery of America's endless rations during the Battle of the Bulge was not just a shock, it was a demoralizing revelation. They realized, perhaps more than at any other moment, that they were fighting an enemy whose strength came not only from weapons, but from supply lines that could deliver chocolate and coffee in the middle of war's deadliest winter.
The American GI who opened a tin of meats or brewed a cup of coffee in the Ardennes rarely thought about where it came from. But behind every ration pack was an entire nation mobilized for war, a colossal system of factories, farms, and workers that transformed the United States into what Franklin Roosevelt had promised, the arsenal of democracy. Take chocolate, for example. By 1944, Hershey's factories in Pennsylvania were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing more than 24 million ration bars every week. These weren't ordinary candy bars, but carefully engineered high-calorie bricks that could withstand tropical heat, resist spoilage, and deliver quick energy in the field. The D ration was designed to taste only slightly better than a boiled potato, so soldiers wouldn't eat it casually. It was an emergency meal. Alongside it came the Tropical Bar, developed for combat in the Pacific. Chocolate became so vital that Hershey received 5 Army-Navy E awards for excellence in wartime production. Coffee, too, was industrialized into a weapon. Before the war, Americans consumed about 2/3 of the world's coffee supply. The military commandeered massive quantities, dehydrating it into instant form. Nestle, with its new Nescafé process, became an essential partner, shipping tons of powdered coffee to Europe and the Pacific. Soldiers learned to mix it with water and canteen cups, joking that it tasted like mud, but drinking it religiously all the same. A GI in Normandy described the ritual: bullets flying, shells falling, and there we were, heating water for coffee. It wasn't just drink, it was home in a cup.
Behind these comforts were American workers, many of them women. With millions of men overseas, factories filled with Rosie the Riveters operating assembly lines. They canned meat, baked biscuits, sealed powdered milk, and rolled chocolate bars. Between 1942 and 1945, American industry produced over 5 billion individual K rations and more than 100 million C ration units. Each soldier's meal was the product of countless hands on assembly lines back home. The scale was staggering. By 1944, the U.S. Army was shipping 17 million tons of supplies to Europe annually, more than the total German army consumed in an entire year. In a single month during the build-up to D-Day, more than 7 million chocolate bars were sent to Britain. Meat canneries in Chicago churned out Spam and corned beef by the millions of tins. Powdered eggs, powdered milk, dehydrated vegetables. Food science advanced rapidly to ensure nutrition could travel across oceans and last for months in warehouses or foxholes. Germany, by contrast, suffered under Allied bombing and resource collapse. Railways shattered, farmland stripped by requisition, food diverted to feed the Reich at home rather than the front. Ersatz substitutes proliferated, coffee made from acorns, butter replaced by gray margarine, meat stretched with filler. In 1944, as American rations grew more diverse and plentiful, German soldiers were often issued bread mixed with sawdust and watery cabbage soup. One Wehrmacht veteran later admitted, "We envied the Americans not for their tanks or planes, but for their food, always coffee, always cigarettes." The difference was more than comfort. It was morale. Studies later found that well-fed troops could march longer, fight harder, and recover faster from fatigue. Hunger gnawed at German morale, while American rations sustained not only bodies, but spirits. A Hershey bar or a steaming cup of coffee wasn't just sustenance. It was a reminder of home, of abundance, of a nation that stood behind its soldiers. The industrial power of the United States meant that even in the deadliest winter of the war, with snow and artillery blanketing the Ardennes, GIs still unwrapped chocolate bars and lit cigarettes issued by the quartermaster. It was democracy itself, packaged in tins and wrappers, arriving daily by convoy and truck.
By January 1945, the Ardennes gamble had failed. The snow-covered forests that Hitler hoped would bring German victory instead became the stage for exhaustion and hunger. German soldiers who had dreamed of reaching Antwerp were now retreating, often barefoot, gaunt, and starving. They had gambled their offensive on capturing American supply depots, and when those proved insufficient or were retaken, the Wehrmacht was left with empty bellies and broken morale. In villages across Belgium, German diaries tell the same story: desperate searches for food. Soldiers raided cellars for potatoes, begged farmers for bread, slaughtered thin cows left behind in frozen barns. One prisoner of war later recalled, "When we were captured, the first thing we asked for was not mercy, but food. The Americans gave us chocolate, and we could not believe such things were ordinary for them." High Command was no better off. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later admitted in his memoirs,
We lost the war of production and the war of supplies. Our soldiers fought with courage, but courage cannot fill a stomach. Even frontline generals grew bitter. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, upon hearing of American rations, allegedly remarked, "The Americans fight a mechanical war, but also a well-fed one. We cannot match them."
The shortages grew catastrophic. By spring 1945, average German soldiers on the Western Front were surviving on fewer than 1,200 calories a day. Bread rations dropped to 200 grams per man. Ersatz coffee, made from acorns or burnt barley, replaced real beans entirely. Starvation became so acute that German civilians and soldiers alike scavenged in fields, pulling up raw turnips to eat. Allied interrogations of captured troops revealed one recurring theme: the shock at the abundance of American food. Many confessed they had believed Nazi propaganda that the Allies were decadent, weak, and soft. Instead, they discovered that abundance bred endurance. Meanwhile, American GIs seemed almost inexhaustible. They smoked real cigarettes, drank hot coffee even in ruined villages, and handed out Hershey bars to liberated children. To German soldiers, the sight was demoralizing in itself. One officer recalled after the war, "It was not the American tanks that defeated us. It was their industry, their endless supplies, and the fact that even their privates lived better than our officers." The Battle of the Bulge had been Germany's last chance to seize the initiative in the West. Instead, it exposed their crippling weakness. The Wehrmacht's collapse was not sudden, but it was inevitable. Hungry men cannot march far, cannot fight long, and cannot maintain faith in a cause that leaves them cold and starving. In the end, German officers had to confront a bitter truth. The Reich had underestimated not just America's manpower or weapons, but the hidden power of its logistics. Hitler had gambled on blitzkrieg speed, but wars of attrition are not won by speed, they are won by supply. And in 1945, the American rations, full of chocolate, coffee, meat, and cigarettes, were more than food. They were proof of a war Germany could no longer sustain.
When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, much of Europe lay in ruins. Cities were rubble, fields were barren, and millions faced hunger. Yet through the devastation, one truth of the war had become unmistakable. It was not only battles, generals, and weapons that determined victory. It was food. The German soldier of 1944 had entered the Ardennes on empty stomachs, clutching rifles but praying for bread. The American soldier faced the same winter, the same shells, but with chocolate in his pocket and hot coffee in his cup. The difference was not merely calories, it was the morale that comes from knowing your nation has your back, that every can of meat and every Hershey bar represented a vast industrial machine working tirelessly across an ocean. The lesson echoed one of Napoleon's oldest maxims: an army marches on its stomach. In World War II, that truth was vindicated on a global scale. The Reich, built on conquest and plunder, could not feed its armies once conquest failed. The United States, built on democracy and industry, mobilized farmers, scientists, and workers to feed not only its own soldiers, but its allies and even liberated civilians.
Historians often measure victory in tanks built, ships launched, or planes flown. But the American rations, simple tins of stew, packets of coffee, and chocolate bars, were weapons in their own right. They carried warmth into frozen foxholes, strength into weary bodies, and hope into men fighting far from home. For the Germans who discovered them, they were symbols of an abundance their own nation could not match. For the Americans, they were proof that democracy's strength was not fragility, but resilience. Albert Speer would later admit, "We were outproduced, outsupplied, and outfought." The war was decided in the factories as much as on the battlefield. Eisenhower put it more simply: the Red Ball Express was our lifeline. Both men, adversaries from opposite sides, recognized the same truth:
that logistics, not just courage, wins wars. In the end, chocolate and coffee were more than luxuries. They were the taste of victory. They symbolized the deeper reality that America's strength lay not only in its weapons, but in its ability to sustain men through every hardship. The stunned reaction of German troops who opened those ration tins in the Ardennes was not just envy. It was recognition that they were facing a nation whose power was measured in factories, farms, and the will to keep its soldiers fed. World War II proved that the fate of nations can rest in something as small as a ration bar, and it left behind a lesson that endures to this day. An army may fight with courage, but it triumphs only when it can also eat.